It was about 10:23 a.m. when a local police officer was making his routine rounds when he came across something unusual at an old fishing spot near the shore of the lake. As he approached, he was confronted with a chilling scene: a young woman. The atmosphere was heavy, and the reality of the tragedy quickly began to sink in. The woman was soon identified as 21-year-old Alexandria Madison Costiel, a senior at the University of Mississippi. Alexandria Madison Costiel, affectionately known to her loved ones as High School Ellie, entered the world on September 11, 1997, bringing light and joy to the lives of her parents, Cindy and Keith Costiel. Raised in the heart of St. Louis, Missouri, Ellie shared her childhood with her younger brother, Andrew, and the two formed a bond that was as close as any siblings could hope to have. From a very early age, Ellie stood out, not just because of her radiant smile or warm personality, but because of the positivity she seemed to carry in every fiber of her being. She wasn't just cheerful, she embodied joy. Her laughter could fill a room, and her enthusiasm for life was both genuine and contagious. From elementary school onward, Ellie excelled in nearly everything she attempted. Her academic talents were matched only by her prowess in athletics. Whether on the soccer field, basketball court, or in the classroom, Ellie always pushed herself to achieve more, not for recognition, but because she believed in doing things wholeheartedly. Teachers frequently described her as a natural leader, someone who encouraged others with kindness and led by example rather than authority. She formed close friendships wherever she went, often being the glue that held her social circles together. But Ellie's impact didn't stop within her own community. Even as a teenager, she demonstrated a rare commitment to humanitarian causes. During high school, she took part in volunteer programs that brought her as far as Peru and several parts of Africa, where she dedicated her time to teaching young children the fundamentals of the English language. These were not fleeting missions or superficial trips. Ellie immersed herself fully in the culture, building relationships, learning local customs, and doing her best to leave behind a legacy of kindness and education. Many of those who met her during these trips recalled her patience, her empathy, and her sincere desire to help others succeed. Upon graduating from high school, Ellie made the decision to attend the University of Mississippi, commonly known as Ole Miss, located in Oxford. While some saw this choice as driven by academics alone, for Ellie, the decision held deeper significance. She was drawn not just to the university's academic reputation, particularly its business and marketing programs, but also to its spirited culture, traditions, and rich history. The southern charm of the campus, the revered football culture, and the sense of community all resonated deeply with her. She admired the professors, appreciated the vibrant social life, and was excited to take part in Greek life. Ellie had always been a romantic at heart. Part of her excitement about attending Ole Miss stemmed from her love for Southern culture and her dream of finding someone who would truly understand her heart. Having had only light-hearted crushes in high school, none of which blossomed into serious relationships, Ellie had long hoped that college might bring her that special connection. She envisioned a future filled with love, laughter, and shared dreams, a happy marriage, a warm home, and children she could raise with the same love she had received from her own parents. During her freshman year, Ellie met a fellow student named Brandon Theld, a charismatic young man from Fort Worth, Texas. From their very first meeting, Ellie was captivated. Brandon had a confidence about him that drew people in, and Ellie was no exception. They began spending a lot of time together, attending parties, sharing long conversations, and appearing side by side at numerous sorority events. Ellie invited him to many of her group gatherings, proudly introducing him to her circle. However, while Ellie saw their connection as meaningful, perhaps even the beginning of something lasting, Brandon seemed to see things differently. Although some referred to them as a couple, their relationship never had the clarity or consistency Ellie hoped for. Brandon would sometimes ignore her for extended periods, even blocking her number, only to reappear weeks later with vague explanations and emotional reassurances. He often claimed he wasn't good enough for her, a line that left Ellie both confused and hopeful, as though his absence stemmed from humility rather than detachment. As time passed, it became clear that Brandon had a pattern. He was emotionally distant, inconsistent, and manipulative in subtle ways. While Ellie yearned for love and connection, Brandon seemed to view the relationship more casually, sometimes exploiting her feelings without reciprocating them in a meaningful way. This imbalance caused Ellie emotional distress. Her mood would swing between moments of joy when they were together, to periods of sadness when he withdrew. She never introduced Brandon to her family, and though she had always been close to her mother, she began to withhold the details of this particular relationship. Cindy, her mother, sensed something was troubling Ellie, but chose to be supportive, waiting for her daughter to open up in her own time. By the summer of 2019, Ellie was preparing to enter her senior year of college. Now, 21 years old, she chose to remain on campus for the summer, focusing on classes and extracurricular activities. She seemed determined to make her final year her best one yet. That July, her parents paid her a visit, and their reunion was full of warmth and affection. Ellie was overjoyed to spend time with them. They talked about her future, her plans post-graduation, and the possibility of moving to a new city to pursue a career in marketing. Then came July 19, 2019, a day that seemed at first like any other. That evening, around 7 p.m., Ellie called her parents from her apartment. She had only just woken up after a long nap. Having studied late into the night for an important test, she had decided to rest during the day. That evening, Ellie spoke to her mother on the phone, just as she often did. Their conversation was relaxed, familiar, and carried no signs of urgency or distress. Ellie shared her plans for later that night, telling her mom that she was going to meet up with some of her friends at a local bar in Oxford. It was a routine outing, one she had done countless times before. The tone of the call was upbeat, and by all accounts, Ellie seemed cheerful and at ease. It was just another normal Friday night for a young woman enjoying her college years. There was no indication, none at all, that this would be the last conversation her mother would ever have with her daughter. Hours later, at exactly 11:52 p.m., a security camera located on Oxford Square captured a clear image of Ellie. The footage showed her leaving the bar alone, walking slowly while gazing down at her phone. She appeared calm, focused on her screen as she moved away from the crowd and nightlife. After she walked away from the square, Ellie hailed a cab. The taxi driver later reported that she had been polite, quiet, and gave clear directions to her residence. She was dropped off at home safely a little after midnight. The following morning, July 20th, 2019, began like any other for local law enforcement in Lafayette County. A deputy with the sheriff's office was conducting routine patrols in the Harmontown area, a peaceful wooded region near Lake Sardis, about 30 miles from the University of Mississippi campus. The area was quiet, mostly used by locals for fishing, hiking, and recreation. But on this day, what was supposed to be an uneventful morning quickly turned into a devastating discovery. At approximately 10:23 a.m., the officer noticed something unusual at a remote, abandoned fishing site along the lake. As he approached, he found the woman. It was immediately clear that there was nothing that could be done. The scene was creepy, and the gravity of the situation quickly set in. The young woman was soon identified as 21-year-old Alexandria Madison Costiel, a senior student at Ole Miss. Her purse was found nearby, and inside it was her student ID and driver's license, which helped authorities quickly confirm her identity. The officer notified investigators, and the scene was swiftly secured for a full forensic investigation. As detectives began combing through the area for clues, they made a chilling discovery. 11 spent shell casings were scattered on the ground, not far from where Ellie was found. This evidence made one thing painfully clear. This was not an accident. It was a violent and deliberate act. The investigation moved rapidly. Detectives searched Ellie's apartment in Oxford, looking for any sign of forced entry or struggle, but everything appeared untouched. One important item, however, was missing: her mobile phone. Investigators attempted to ping the phone's GPS, but it only returned a vague signal in Oxford, offering no precise location. Still, this small digital thread became the first break in the case. Fortunately, Ellie had been wearing a smartwatch that was synced to her phone. The smartwatch remained in her apartment and still had recent message data stored. Investigators soon discovered that incoming messages were mirrored on the device, revealing a vital clue. The last person Ellie had texted before her death, and, crucially, the person she had arranged to meet after leaving the bar, was someone she knew well: Brandon Theld, a 22-year-old classmate from her university and the same young man she'd spent months emotionally entangled with. What followed next painted a troubling picture. Although Brandon and Ellie had never officially declared themselves a couple, those closest to Ellie knew that she had strong feelings for him. To Ellie, their relationship might have been undefined but still full of hope. But to Brandon, it seemed Ellie was just a convenience, someone to entertain when it suited him. The emotional imbalance was evident in their messages. When police contacted Brandon and asked him to come in for questioning, he initially agreed. But when the scheduled time arrived, he never showed up. Investigators followed up with a call, and Brandon offered a strange excuse. He claimed he had been drinking the night before and didn't feel it was appropriate to speak with detectives while he was still impaired. So, officers scheduled a new appointment for the following morning. But once again, Brandon failed to appear. This time, it wasn't a miscommunication or a hangover. Brandon had vanished. Detectives now had sufficient reason to believe he was evading law enforcement. A warrant for his arrest was immediately issued, and he was officially declared a fugitive. Police began tracking his known contacts and movements. A description of his vehicle was broadcast to law enforcement agencies across the region. Within hours, the Memphis Police Department's fugitive task force received a tip and located Brandon at a gas station. He was arrested without incident and extradited back to Mississippi, where he was held in custody without bail. From the start, Brandon refused to cooperate, declining to speak until he had an attorney present. On July 23, 2019, Brandon appeared in court for the first time. He was formally charged with the murder of Alexandria Costial. The courtroom was filled with reporters, grieving friends, and community members stunned by the sudden and senseless loss of a young life full of potential. But the question lingered. Why? What could possibly have driven this young man to such a horrifying decision? Investigators believed the answers could be found in the hundreds of text messages exchanged between Brandon and Ellie in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. As they sifted through the conversations, a painful truth began to emerge. Shortly before her death, Ellie had messaged Brandon, telling him she was late, and she suspected she might be pregnant. She had taken a pregnancy test, and the result appeared positive. Brandon's replies were swift and cold. He did not express concern for her well-being or ask questions. Instead, he stated that if she really was pregnant, he wanted her to take care of it immediately. He strongly insisted she not go through with it, saying it would ruin his life. Ellie, in contrast, had sent long, emotional, and heartfelt messages, not out of pressure or drama, but out of confusion, fear, and a desire to understand how the person she cared for could respond with such detachment. She didn't demand anything from him. She wasn't trying to trap him. She was simply reaching out in a moment of vulnerability, likely hoping for compassion. What she received instead was rejection. Investigators now believed that this conversation, particularly her intention to meet him that night to talk in person, had escalated tensions between the two. Faced with an overwhelming and deeply personal crisis, Ellie found herself emotionally cornered, struggling with uncertainty, fear, and an agonizing silence from the very person she thought would support her. She didn't know what to do. The young woman was always close to her family, particularly her mother. But in this moment, perhaps out of fear of disappointing them or adding stress to their lives, she chose to bear the burden alone. She withheld the truth from her parents, trying as best she could to mask the panic that had taken root within her. Instead of leaning on them for comfort, Ellie quietly retreated into herself, battling the emotional storm in isolation. Meanwhile, Brandon's response was not only distant, it was coldly dismissive. Despite receiving message after message from Ellie, expressing confusion, vulnerability, and even fear, he maintained a flat refusal to speak with her in person. He offered no emotional support, no sense of responsibility, and no compassion. Instead, he repeatedly made it clear he did not want to deal with the situation, and especially not the possibility of fatherhood. To those who knew him, Brandon's reaction came as no surprise. His reputation had always carried a certain arrogance. He was often referred to as a daddy's boy, someone who seemed to float through life with the kind of entitlement only deep family wealth could afford. Brandon often bragged, sometimes joking, sometimes not, that his father's money and influence could make anything go away. He believed that consequences were for other people, not for him. But this time, that belief would cost more than just his freedom. It would cost a life. As the investigation deepened, the evidence against Brandon began to mount, substantially and undeniably. There wasn't just circumstantial suspicion. There were physical links that pointed directly to him. Detectives discovered ballistic evidence at the crime scene, 11 spent shell casings that matched a pistol registered to Brandon. More damning still, DNA traces were found on his shirt, later confirmed to be Ellie's. And from Ellie's smartwatch, still synchronized to her phone, investigators retrieved the text messages confirming she had made arrangements to meet Brandon on the night of her death. But the case didn't stop there. Investigators soon uncovered chilling details that painted a much darker picture. This was not a crime of passion. This wasn't a spontaneous act born from an emotional confrontation. Instead, the facts suggested something planned, premeditated, and calculated. 1 week before the tragedy, on Friday, July 12th, Brandon left Oxford and returned to his family home in Fort Worth, Texas. During this trip, he retrieved the pistol later used in the crime. Not only that, but he photographed the weapon and posted it on social media, captioning it with an unsettling message: "Finally bringing my baby back to Oxford." The caption didn't raise flags at the time, but in hindsight, it was a chilling sign of what was to come. As detectives examined Brandon's internet search history, the evidence became even more disturbing. In the days leading up to Ellie's death, Brandon had searched topics such as how to get away with committing a crime, how to plan a murder, tactical face masks, and gun silencers. These weren't idle curiosities or random rabbit holes. They were deliberate, focused queries that pointed to someone preparing for an act. One of the most heartbreaking realizations came when investigators pieced together how Brandon manipulated Ellie into meeting with him. He knew she still hoped for some kind of emotional resolution, especially in light of her pregnancy scare. So, on July 17th, Brandon initiated a conversation for the first time in nearly 3 months. He told her he was ready to talk. He pretended that he finally wanted to acknowledge the pregnancy and discuss what came next. Hopeful and emotionally exhausted, Ellie believed him. Then, in the early morning hours of Thursday, July 18th, around 2 a.m., Ellie sent Brandon a deeply personal message. It included a photo of her abdomen. She was anxious, but also relieved, thinking the moment had finally come when they could have an honest conversation. For Brandon, however, this may have been the trigger that pushed his plan into motion. On the very same day, he began probing further, asking if Ellie's friends would be around when they met. At first, it seemed like a logical concern. It was, after all, a sensitive topic. Ellie, interpreting this as a desire for privacy, reassured him that her friends would not be present. She felt relieved, even grateful, that he was showing interest in talking. But in truth, Brandon was ensuring that no one would witness their meeting or be able to quickly alert authorities if something went wrong. The date was set. On Friday, July 19th, Ellie promised she would leave the bar early to meet him. She didn't want to risk missing the opportunity. That night, after her time out with friends, surveillance footage confirmed her return home. At 1:14 a.m., cameras captured Brandon's vehicle, a distinctive truck with a unique license plate, driving toward Ellie's residence. Just minutes later, another camera recorded the same vehicle heading in the opposite direction, this time with Ellie inside. Their phones, tracked through GPS data, were then traced traveling together through Oxford and toward the remote area near Lake Sardis. Detectives would later learn that Brandon had been drinking heavily the day prior and was seen consuming alcohol again even after arriving at the lakeside location. Witnesses and forensic evidence supported that he brought Ellie to a picnic area by the water. It was here, at this remote site, that they sat down and began discussing the pregnancy. According to the timeline and behavioral analysis, the conversation became tense. Brandon, likely overwhelmed by fear and anger, stepped away from the table. He walked back to his truck, possibly to retrieve the weapon, before returning to where Ellie was sitting. And then, the irreversible happened. No words were recorded from that moment, no last exchange, just the trail of evidence left behind, the shell casings, the heartbreak, and the unanswered question of why a young woman's future had to end that night. In the hours that followed their final interaction near Lake Sardis, Both Ellie's and Brandon's phones continued to transmit signals, bouncing off the same cell towers as they moved together. This digital trail, an unspoken witness to their last journey, helped investigators later reconstruct their movements with chilling precision. But not long after the time Ellie was believed to have lost her life, her phone suddenly went dark. The signal disappeared. Authorities suspected Brandon had manually powered down the device and disposed of it, either by tossing it into the lake or destroying it in some other way to hinder future tracking. What came next painted a deeply disturbing portrait of emotional detachment. According to multiple witnesses, Brandon returned to town as though nothing had happened. He joined friends, drank beer, and reportedly showed off his pistol, the same weapon believed to have been used in the crime. His behavior was unsettling, boastful, carefree, and completely void of remorse. There were no outward signs of stress or guilt. He didn't isolate himself, he didn't hide, he partied, he mingled, he laughed. And all the while, Ellie's loved ones had no idea she was already gone. But justice, though sometimes slow, was steadily catching up to him. By August 2019, Brandon's name had made its way into local headlines. What had started as a missing person case had now become a full-scale homicide investigation. The Oxford community, along with the broader University of Mississippi family, was stunned by the details beginning to emerge. The tragedy of Ellie's story, her kindness, her promise, her brutal end, became front-page news, and the alleged perpetrator, a fellow student, someone she trusted, was now the focus of statewide attention. On August 22nd, Brandon appeared in court for a bail hearing. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense, but the hearing took an unexpected turn. Rather than move forward with the request for Brandon's release, his attorney suddenly withdrew the motion. Instead, the defense team made a strategic shift. They asked the judge to order a full psychological evaluation, implying that Brandon's mental health should be considered in evaluating the nature of the crime. It was a common legal tactic. If a defendant could be proven mentally unfit, it might reduce the charges, delay proceedings, or at the very least, complicate the prosecution's path. Brandon's legal team appeared to be laying the groundwork for a future defense based on diminished capacity or emotional instability. The judge, cautious but thorough, approved the evaluation request. However, he also denied Brandon's release, citing the severity of the charges and the risk of flight. Brandon would remain in custody without bail, and the psychological review would proceed in the weeks to follow. As Brandon sat behind bars, prosecutors began building their case with unshakable resolve. They sifted through evidence, digital data, eyewitness testimony, and the contents of Brandon's own devices. His text messages, search history, and travel records all helped paint a clear picture of intent and premeditation. Just 8 days after the bail hearing, on August 30th, 2019, Brandon was back in court, this time to face formal charges. What had initially been classified as a homicide investigation now took a sharper legal form. Brandon was officially charged with the kidnapping and first-degree murder of Alexandria Costial. Both charges were considered capital offenses, and under Mississippi law could be punishable by death. The findings of the court-ordered psychological evaluation were also revealed. Brandon was deemed sane, competent, and fully capable of standing trial. This meant the legal system would proceed accordingly, without accommodations for mental illness. Still, despite the mounting evidence, the ballistic matches, DNA samples, surveillance footage, and manipulated messages, Brandon pleaded not guilty. As 2019 drew to a close, and the calendar turned to 2020, a new complication arose: the global COVID-19 pandemic. The public health crisis brought with it sweeping delays across all sectors, including the judicial system. Court proceedings were postponed, jury selections were put on hold, and Brandon's case, like many others, was pushed further down the calendar. The Costial family waited. Ellie's friends waited. The community waited. More than a year passed. By the time the court system had stabilized and the trial was set to begin, Brandon's strategy shifted again. No longer defiant, no longer pleading innocence, he requested a plea deal. On August 27, 2021, Brandon appeared in court and pleaded guilty to the murder of Alexandria Costial. The decision shocked many who had braced for a lengthy, emotionally grueling trial. But behind closed doors, prosecutors had made a calculated decision. While they had enough evidence to pursue the death penalty, securing such a verdict is rarely straightforward. Death penalty cases require years of litigation, extensive appeals, and airtight evidence that can withstand every level of scrutiny. Instead, state prosecutors agreed to a compromise: a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In doing so, they spared Ellie's family from the torment of a long trial and ensured that Brandon would never walk free again.